I'm building a new workbench for my shop at home, and I'm sharing the experience here on video. Now, in the first video, we talked about building the base assembly for this style of bench. It's a cabinet style base that's going to keep dust and chips out from underneath the bench, and it's going to be filled with a drawer unit that's going to add storage and again keep my shop neater. Now, since the last video covered the base construction, we have a little bit of a choose your own adventure. We could make the top, or we could build the drawer case next. I'm going with the drawer case because I like having this big open space to be able to just lower it right into place. Now, in order to accommodate that drawer case though, what I need to do is build some support on the inside. So I found some reclaimed construction lumber and I added 2 pieces on each end. Now those are easily enough screwed into the legs. But this center support here, I can't really screw into anything, and I don't really want fasteners exposed on the outside. So what I did is drilled some pocket holes and then added screws into those holes to make the connection. Now what we can do is concentrate on the case construction. Most of that's going to take place over at the table saw. Building the drawer case that's going to go inside the base of my workbench starts with cutting out the case pieces. Now I'm using MDF here because even though it's heavy to begin with and to work with, it's going to make a really solid case, and the pieces are nice and flat and smooth. I did get things started by applying a strip of edging along what will be the front edges of the pieces. Covers up the MDF, and I'm using fur just like the rest of the bench, so it's going to blend right in. What I want to do now is cut a rabbet on the back edge of the 2 side pieces. So I have a dado blade set up in the table saw, and the width of cut matches the thickness of some 1/4 inch plywood, and the height allows me to drive some screws through the plywood into the back. The next step in the process takes a little departure from your typical case construction. I'm going to cut out this back corner of the 2 case sides. As we go along, you'll see that this will create some clearance for using hold downs and hold fasts on the bench top. In order to make this cut, you have a couple of options. You could use a jigsaw or even a bandsaw, but I'm going to stay right here at the table saw. When you want to make stopped cuts like this, you'll do it in 2 separate operations. The first thing that you'll need to do is lay out the shape and the locations for those cuts. The next thing is to set up the rip fence to cut the baseline here. Now you'll see that I've raised the saw blade up to its full height. And the reason for that is that at the front edge of the cut, the teeth are going to be as vertical as possible. Now there's still going to be a little bit of an arc there, so I'm going to cut past my line just a little bit and then draw the piece back. Then I'll reposition the rip fence and make this second cut. The key here though is you want that waste piece to be on the outside of the blade. You don't want it between the blade and the rip fence where it could get trapped and come kicking back at you. The nice thing about this drawer case is that it's fully enclosed and supported by the base of the bench, so I don't have to be too precious with the joinery. On this case, I'm just going to assemble everything using screws, which is why I'm here at the drill press. I've installed a combination pilot bit and countersink bit in the drill press. I find that it gives me nice square holes, and I can use the fence to make sure they're located accurately. For that location, I've drawn a line 3/8 of an inch up, which will center the screws on the thickness of the top and bottom. Now the spacing really doesn't matter, but I like to lay things out neatly anyway. It's just part of my personality. What is kind of critical though is the location of where those end holes are. You want to drill them about 1 inch in from both the front and back. That's going to provide a little bit more support and hopefully prevent that MDF from splitting as you drive the screws in. I've set the drill press at a pretty high speed to help drill the holes efficiently. With the clearance holes drilled in the sides of our case, we can start to bring the whole thing together. Now, with MDF like this, glue joints on an end grain of MDF just don't really hold that well. So I'm just going to rely on the screws here. And now I can use the clearance holes in the sides to drill the pilot holes into our top and bottom. Now to keep everything together, I'm using these clamping squares. I have 2 at the top on the front and then 2 on the back on the bottom, and that holds the parts in alignment. It's really helpful because what you didn't see is me trying to get to this point here. We're really not at that point in our relationship to be able to watch me fumble around here. But these clamping squares do make a big difference. So what I can do now is switch out to a driver bit, and I'm going to use relatively long screws here. Because I'm going into the MDF, I want the screws to be able to have the strongest connection possible. Installing the ends to the top and bottom may actually really be the easy part of this project because you have some simple registration. I'm looking for a flush surface on the top and a nice square corner. When it comes to the center divider though, things get a little trickier because there's a few things that we're trying to juggle. First, we want to divide the space evenly in half. Second, we want to make sure that this piece goes in plumb and square. So let's see how I got there. You can see that I'm using the clamping squares again. But what I did to get me started was to mark some center lines, both on the top and the bottom, as well as marking a center line on the front edge of my divider. Now, the divider's made up of 2 layers of 1/2 inch plywood, so on the back, I can use that seam as my center line. Now I want to make sure that they're lined up as close as possible here and then apply the clamping squares. If you're off a little bit, you can still grab a mallet and make some minor adjustments one way or the other until everything's lined up. Then it's time to make sure that it's square and plumb. So for that, I grab a long combination square, even a framing square that if it's accurate, and set it in place on the base. You can see that everything again is nice and square. Here again, use a mallet to tap the divider one way or the other to get it lined up. It's going to go a long way to make sure that the drawers that we make later on are easy to make and install. The second dimension to take care of is checking to see that the divider is square front to back on the assembly. Again, make some minor adjustments. Check at the bottom and the top because you don't want to introduce any twist into your panel. Then everything is just like before, where we can carry the pilot holes through into the divider and drive the screws. It's time to divide the drawer case into the individual compartments for the drawers themselves. There's going to be 8 drawers. So to divide the case, I'm using 6 web frames, just like it shows in the plans. However, those plans show the web frames being joined together with bridle joints. Now I decided that this was a good opportunity to try something a little bit quicker. So instead of bridle joints, I'm using pocket screws to connect the front and back rail to the long side rails. Now, a little point about the construction here that I want to highlight is that the side rails are continuous front to back. That way, as the drawer slides in and out, it's not going to bump over the top of the joinery sections where they would meet. It just helps the wear and tear and the operation of the drawer. Just need to cut your parts to size to match the opening in your case. So you'll need to take into account the width of the 2 side rails when cutting the front and back rails to length. For the joinery, all you need to do is fit the long front and back pieces into your pocket hole jig, center them on the guide block, clamp it down and drill a pair of holes on each end. When it comes to installing web frames with pocket screws, I like to clamp everything together. That way I know that the pieces aren't going to shift while I drive the pocket screws in place. I'm going to go with a belt and suspenders approach here and put a little bit of glue on each end of the long rails. There are 2 things that I'm looking for as I'm applying the clamps. First, I want the front and back edges to be flush. And then I also want this underneath edge surface to be flush as well, because that's where the drawer is going to ride on, and I just want to avoid any places for the drawer to catch. Okay, now I can drive the pocket screws in. All right, with the screws holding them in place, I can pull the clamps off. And the last detail that I want to add is to apply a thin piece of edging. Now this edging is going to do two things. It's going to cover up the end grain on the two side rails, and is going to match the edging on the case for the drawer compartment. Clamping edging can be pretty tricky, so what I use is just strips of masking tape that I can pull down over the edging and onto the side, making sure that this top surface is flush. Now I'll bring the drawer box back in and we can install the web frames. Now just like when we were assembling the drawer case, one of the things that we need to do when installing the web frames is make sure that they're aligned. What you don't want to do is end up with kind of cockeyed web frames that are going to make fitting the drawers a nightmare. So rather than go off of layout lines, what I've done is cut a pair of plywood spacers to match the height of both the drawer opening and the thickness of the web frame. So what I can do is slide the web frame in from the back, make sure that it's aligned at the front, and now when I attach it, I know that I'm going to have a consistent drawer opening, and then when I use these same spacers on the other side, that side is going to match this one as well. Now to attach the web frames to the case, I've drilled pocket holes in the top of the web frame, and that's going to allow me to attach these securely. Now you notice that this one has a little bit of a warp into it, but if I hold it down as I drive the screw, I know that it's going to be nice and level. It's time to add some storage to my workbench. Now up until this point, we've built the base of the bench in a cabinet style, and I've made the drawer case to go with it. Now the base is largely framed with Douglas fir, and the drawer case, I edged the MDF pieces and the web frames with Douglas fir. For the drawer boxes themselves, I'm going to use white fir, which has a different look to it. It looks more like white pine. And I'm going to use the same material on the top of the bench. I think it's going to provide some nice contrast. So my next order of operations is to size the parts. I have the blanks here for the drawer fronts because I want to show off a detail that I want to incorporate. Now, say like for the top drawers, I have one long board here that will give me enough material for both drawer fronts. And what I want to do is cut those drawer fronts sequentially from the board so you can see the grain pattern flow from one drawer to the next. But to get things started, I'm going to set the rip fence and cut the long blanks so that they just barely fit the openings in the case. I have my blanks for the drawer fronts ripped to their final width so that they just fit those openings. Now I want to cross cut them to length, again, trying to keep it as tight as I can. Now I did notice when I was measuring that the length of the openings on the right-hand side versus the left-hand side, there is a little bit of variance as much as I tried to keep that divider perfectly centered. So I have a stop block set up on my miter gauge fence to cut the drawer fronts for the right-hand side of the drawers. Then I'll reset it up and cut the left-hand side. Now one other thing that I did before this step is to square up one corner of all of the blanks. That way I can cut the drawer fronts sequentially from the blank. Last time when we were at the table saw, I was cutting the drawer fronts for my case here. And you can see that I have all 8 of the drawer fronts, and I've arranged it so that the grain flows from one side to the other on each one of those. Now in the course of the next few steps in cutting the joinery and getting everything to fit, it's really easy to start to get things flipped around and mismatched. So I want to show you what I do to organize the parts here. So we'll get the top drawer fronts out real quick. Oftentimes when I'm working on a project, I'll use a cabinet maker's triangle to help me orient parts when I'm working. So the triangle usually faces the front of the project, and then I know what the back is and the right and the left sides are. When you have something where you have pairs like this, rather than use just a plain triangle, you can see that I have a pair of right triangles. So with the right angle on these triangles, that's pointing towards the middle of the project, so that I know as I'm going along here that this is very clearly the right-hand drawer, this is very clearly the left-hand drawer. I also know that since the triangles are on the top, this is my top edge of the fronts. So it's a quick and easy way to avoid confusion as you go along. For now though, I'm going to put these back into place just because they look so pretty and it's a nice backdrop. Because we're going to focus on the drawer sides here. And with the sides, I'm going to start by cutting the tails for the half-blind dovetails. I like to cut the tails first. Don't know why. It's just my personal preference. So I've laid out on one of these an arrangement of the tails that I like. As I do so, one of the things I want to do is mark some way to show where the waist is on here, because again, in the middle of this whole process, it's really easy to start cutting on the wrong side of the line or remove material that you really don't want to. Now when I'm working with soft material like this fur and stuff that's relatively thin, it's about 1/2 of an inch thick, with the two sides what I can do is clamp them together and cut them at exactly the same time. But to do that, we're going to work on a little bit of layout here first. The first thing to do is to create a baseline so I know where those tails are going to end. So I set up a marking gauge to about 5/8 of an inch, and I'm going to scribe that baseline on all 4 sides. The next thing that I'm going to do is put the sides together in the orientation that I want them to be, and I drew another triangle on here to indicate either the top or the bottom edge of your pieces. Just to keep things straight, I'll work with these as the top edge to match the triangles that I drew on the drawer fronts. Now, since I can cut both of these at the same time with them lined up, I'll put a clamp on them to keep them together. And we'll put this whole assembly in the vise. And now I'm going to use a dovetail gauge, I guess, or a marker to transfer my lines from the one that I've already done to this outer one. So I can line it up with my pencil line on this first one, draw it across, and then down to the baseline. I'll just take care of all the top lines first. There you go. And again, let's just make sure that we mark our waste areas. There's no real magic in a specific layout or shape or size of your dovetails. They can be whatever you think looks right. So I like having the 3 tails on the side, and we'll cut those matching pins and sockets on the drawer fronts later on. Now we're ready to cut the tails, and I'm going to use, I have a Western style back saw here that I'm going to use. You could just as easily use a Japanese style pull saw and do the same thing. Again, the specific tools don't matter, it's just getting comfortable with the whole process. So what I'm going to do is start by making a cut across the top of my 2 side pieces here, and then try and match the angle as I go down and cut just to the baseline. Now we're going to use these pieces to mark the fronts and backs, so whether I wander a little bit from the layout lines, it's not too big of a deal. All right, so there you can see, pretty close to the line in some places, not as close in others. There's a lot of dovetails here. I'm going to get some practice in it. So what we can do now is remove the waste between the tails. The ends are pretty easy. I can just clamp the assembly together and go right at the baseline with my saw. Until those pieces pop out. Now for the waste in between here, you can go in with a coping saw and cut down the baseline, or you can use a chisel and just chisel it away, which I think is what I'm going to do. I'm going to stay just a little bit away from my baseline to chop down about halfway through, and I'll flip it over and I'll release that cut. There you can see, now what I'm going to do is just slowly work my way back to those baselines on this piece and then repeat that for the other side. All right, so there's one side of the tails taken care of. I'll do the same thing over here, and then we can talk about creating the pins on the drawer front. All right, we're ready to transfer the shape of our tails onto the drawer front. So we want to grab it out of the case here and, again, align our triangles. So I have the left-hand side of the drawer front and the left-hand drawer side. Now, before we get started with a pencil, we need to mark a couple of baselines. The first is a baseline on the end of the tail, or on the end of the drawer front, that matches the length of the tails. So to do that, I just used that same marking gauge that I had set up when I did the baseline on the sides. The other baseline is on the inside face. That represents the thickness of our drawer side. For that, I have a second marking gauge that I use to mark that. Now, with all the other drawers that I have going on, having 2 separate, visually different marking gauges is going to help me to stay organized and avoid mismarking. I'm not sure who mismarking is, but she can often get in the way of a successful project. Next, what we want to do is to now make that transfer. So let me align this here so you can see what I'm talking about. I'm going to align the inside corner at the baseline of my side with the corner on the drawer front. And then with a mechanical pencil, I can trace the shape of the tails. And then I'll just take care of the other side. You can see what I did here in doing the same thing. So once you have the profile taken care of, you can use a square and transfer those lines in a straight line down the inside face to mark out where you need to remove. Now, once again, I used some X's to label where my waste area is going to be. We're going to cut along these lines with a handsaw and then remove the waste with a chisel. However, the pencil lines aren't something you want to cut through. You want to keep those pencil lines, because otherwise if you remove those pencil lines, you're going to end up with a gappy fit on your dovetails. Now, because these are half-blind dovetails, I won't be able to get all the way down. What I'm going to do is make basically triangular shaped cuts here. So I want to get right to the baseline on the top of the board as I'm looking at it, and right to the baseline on the inside face. I'm more concerned about accuracy at this point than any kind of a race and how fast of a sawyer I am. So now what I can do is remove the board, and I'm going to use a hold down here to just anchor it in place. I'm going to grab the chisel and mallet here, and starting, I don't know, about halfway back, a little less, make a series of blows. And then I can come in from the end and pop out the waste. And then just start working my way both down and back. All right, let me show you where I am right now. I'm almost back to the baselines on the inside face, and I'm just about to the baseline on the bottom. What I'll do now is switch, instead of pounding now, I'm going to use a series of paring cuts using just the pressure of my upper body or arms to ease down, especially along the sides here. What you'll want to avoid is just going too hard with a mallet where you can end up splitting down through the face of the piece. All right, I have all the waste cleaned out from the two sets of pins that I cut on the drawer front. And as you can see, this side, I'm actually pretty pleased with how it turned out. The only unfortunate thing that happened, and it happens especially when you're working with softwood, is I had a little chip come out of the corner here. No worries, I was able to save it. I'll glue it back in at final assembly and pair it flush, and it'll look okay. This side, on the other hand, not as good, so we won't show that as well. I have a few more drawers to practice on. Chances are my skills are going to get a little bit better. So I'll get those taken care of, and then we'll talk about joining the backs and adding the bottoms later on. Now, the lion's share of the work on the drawers is taken up by cutting the half-blind dovetails at the front. Now, we still have to tackle the joinery at the back of the drawer. Now, there's all kinds of ways that you can do it, and a lot of them are traditional, from through dovetails to just nailing the back in place. I'm going to take a little bit of a middle path here, and I'm going to cut a dado on the inside face of the drawer sides to hold the back. Now, on the back, I'll cut a mating tongue to fit in those dados. So to do that, I have a 1/4-inch dado blade set up here on the table saw, and I've set up the rip fence to act as an end stop. The dados here will go pretty quickly, and then we'll talk about forming the tongues on the end of the drawer back. The process for cutting the tongue on the drawer back looks pretty similar as cutting the dado, but there's a couple of differences here. I attached a tall auxiliary fence to the rip fence, and that allows me to bring the fence right up to the edge of the dado stack so that I'm getting the length of dado that I want. Then you want to make a couple of test cuts on a scrap piece of wood here just to dial in both the height of the blade and its exposure so you get a nice snug fit in the dados in the drawer sides. Otherwise, cutting is just a matter of holding the workpiece down against the saw table as you make a pass on each end. The final joinery component of our drawers is to cut a groove that will accept the drawer bottom. Now the big thing here is locating that groove. What you want to make sure is that it's not going to be visible when the drawer is pulled out. So I'm going to locate it so that the groove will be right inside this first socket on the bottom edge. To do that, I'm using the drawer front as a setup gauge, and I can line it up with the tooth on the dado blade so that that tooth falls just to the inside edge of that half pin. Now when the drawer side fits over the top of it, the groove is going to be covered up. The other thing you want to make sure is to set up all your pieces so that the bottom edge of all the drawer parts are up against the rip fence. Now we're ready to start assembling the drawers for the workbench. Now the last thing that I needed to do was to cut the drawer bottom to size. I'm using 1/4-inch hardboard here. Now here's something that I've learned the hard way is I used to dry assemble the drawer box, measure for the drawer bottom, and then make sure that I cut the drawer bottom so that it was less width and length in each dimension so that I wouldn't have to worry about it binding. But what you want to do instead is to cut the drawer bottom so that it's pretty snug fit, because the drawer bottom plays a key role in helping keep your drawer box square as you put the glue in. So another thing that I like to do is make sure all of my joints fit well, so dry assemble the drawer beforehand. And if the drawer joints fit a little snug, that's kind of what I prefer. Again, I think that helps keep everything square as you go along. So let's get started here. What I'm going to do is work from one end of the drawer to the other end. I'll start by putting a little bit of glue into the sockets here, and then along the drawer bottom groove, because I can glue it in place where it's just going to make a stronger assembly. Put a little bit in the dado here. There we go. So I'm going to start by putting the drawer side in place here. Then I'll fit the back. Now the bottom will slide right into place. Dispose of the extra. Now because I have tight fitting joints, I really don't need clamps. The only thing that I want to do is make sure that the relationship between the front and the sides is 90 degrees. So I'm going to use clamping squares like these to help keep everything in alignment. So I just set them in place, tighten them down, There, now I know that the front corners of my drawer are square. The joints are nice and tight. I have a little bit of glue squeeze out that I'll take care of a little bit later on. But now it's just a matter of repeating this 7 more times and the drawers for the bench are done.